My name is Ilya Kaminsky. I was born and raised in the city of Odessa, Ukraine. My family left when I was 16 years old. And I have been coming back almost every summer for many years now. In fact, I have just returned from Odessa about 4 weeks ago. Many people in the West seem to be under the impression that this war of invasion by Russia against Ukraine has been happening since February 2022. That is not the case. This war has been ongoing for many years now. I have been coming back to Odessa and I have seen thousands of refugees. People say that Odessa is not as badly affected as other areas in Ukraine. It's not nearly as bombed as Mariupol or not nearly as devastated as Bucha. That's true, which is to say, it is not bombed every hour like Mariupol. It is bombed every other day. In fact, where my uncle lives in Odessa, on the block he lives, that block has been bombed. The cemetery where my grandmother is buried has been bombed. That is also the situation. I don't know what else to say, except this is a war that has been happening for years now.
Hello, my name is Margaret Etwuod. I'm happy to be here at the 8th International Literary Festival of Odessa, although it's in Georgia and I'm in Canada. The whole world has been shocked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and by the devastation that has been caused. And we have all been amazed and encouraged by Ukraine's determination and resistance. As writers, especially if we've been active in PEN International, we know that this is in part a struggle between the forces of creativity and freedom of expression and the forces of censorship and repression. Many of us have studied the effects of totalitarianisms on artists and writers. Censorship, exile, assassination, defamation, and the imprisonment of writers simply for having written something displeasing to tyrants have been among these effects. What chance would any kind of honest writer have in a regime that has already made it a crime to call a war a war? I look forward to a time when we can all meet in person in Odessa itself and share our writing as we would wish to do. Good luck.
What I think about this war, I'm reading all the newspapers every day. I think it's a ridiculous war. I think it's a completely stupid, pathetic war. It's such a retard war, a retrograde war. We're in 2022 and this war is catapulting us back as if it was somewhere in the 1930s or the 1810s or even before that. It feels way too old-fashioned for 2022. And it's such an incredible loss of course, of human lives and of energy and resources, raw materials, political energy, human suffering. But most of all, this war is such a waste of time. My hope was that once the pandemic was over, we were finally going to work on the biggest challenge that lies ahead of us, climate change, biodiversity loss, getting across our planetary boundaries. And almost in the very same week that the pandemic seemed more or less in control, this completely pathetic war started. And I think it's most of all a war that will constitute an incredible waste of time. And there are few things that make me as sad and worried as losing time right now.
Just today, we had 3 explosions in Kabul, in west of the city where I used to live. And it's really heartbreaking to see that all these explosions are happening still in Afghanistan. But it is not only today. It has been happening in the last 4 decades. My grandfather had to leave Afghanistan over 40 years ago because of the Soviet Union's invasion. And a few years later, the same thing happened to my father and my family. And just last year, I had to do the same thing. I had to leave the country after the collapse of Kabul into the hands of Taliban. So I had to leave Afghanistan. I had to leave Kabul, my house, with only 2 small suitcases coming to Germany. And the same story is happening to my kids. They are growing up somewhere that they don't know the culture, they don't know the language, and they have to start from zero. If you look at it, it has been 4 generations for us, my grandfather, my father, me, and also my sons. And with the war in Ukraine, it's really heartbreaking that we don't learn from the history. And sometimes I think maybe Hegel was right. He said once that we learn from history, that we don't learn from history. But there should be some sort of solution somewhere. And I hope one day we can achieve. If we could do something, if we together can do something, let's do it. Let's end all the wars.
Hi, my name is Olivier Guez. I'm a French writer. I use this camera to say how much I admire the Ukrainians and how much I support the fight. I hope so much they will win this war against the Russians, against the aggression of the Russians, against Vladimir Putin, and to say that this has been a constant source of admiration, I mean, since the beginning of the war. Slava Ukraina.
As we are honoring Ukraine and the bravery of the Ukrainian people faced with the terrible invasion of Russia, as President Emerita of PEN International, I remember being in Lviv in 2017 when we were invited and hosted by the PEN Ukrainian Center. At that time, it was an important Congress because we passed important changes to the PEN Charter, as well as unanimously passing the PEN International Women's Manifesto. In addition to this, several of us were there in search of our past, the past of our families. This included Paul Auster, Philippe Sands, Judith Rodriguez, and myself. Following the Congress, I traveled with my son to Odessa to see if we could find any memories of our family there. So I'm going to read a poem which I wrote called To Odessa for Richard. If I could write water, you would swim or drink when I wrote sea, ocean, drinking glass full. If I could write sunlight, you would warm outside the shade of the orange tree grove as you read the line, you would warm outside the shade. If I could write bath water, you could wash. In the red rain, we are not wet when I write umbrella. Here, Take my written bomb, guns and pistols, baby bottle filled with milk, and my written bandages in black ink. Does anyone remember their wishes from birthdays years ago? If you could read me buying a ticket, you'd meet me on the train to Odessa. I'd give you my written hands to cover your written eyes. Thank you.
Air raids, sirens in Ukraine sound sometimes 200 times per day. Thousands of civilians are killed by Russian shellings, among them hundreds of children killed and wounded. The war is going on already for more than half a year. If you are not a Ukrainian, you should not think that this war is not yours. This is a war in Europe. This is a war of Russia against European values, against democracy. So please, support Ukraine, stand with Ukraine, learn about Ukraine in order to understand why Ukrainian soldiers are so fiercely resisting Russian aggression. Please, read non-fiction books about Ukrainian history. Try to find out more about Ukrainian culture. Read books written by Ukrainian authors. This will help you to understand why Ukraine wants to be independent and why Ukraine is a European country with a European future.
At the beginning of the war in the Ukraine, the Chancellor of Germany or the French President said Ukraine shouldn't lose the war. It was wrong to speak like this. Ukraine should win the war. And this is the situation in which we are today. If we give them enough weapons, Ukraine can and must win the war. It means that if we have to put our solidarity as strong as possible with all the weapons that they need to win the war, they win the war for freedom and liberty.
Ich bin Radka Denemarková von Prag. Ich wurde im Prager Frühling 1968 geboren. Also ich habe schon eine Okkupation erlebt und das hat lange gedauert. In diesem Jahr erlebe ich wieder einen Krieg und das war keine Überraschung. Die Politik von dem Präsidenten Putin war immer die gleiche, also die Repressionspolitik in Innenpolitik und ganz, ganz aggressiv in der Außenpolitik. Aber das öffnet auch neue Fragen. Wir haben in Europa wirklich die Demokratie auf Business reduziert. Wir haben keine Visionen. Und dieser Kampf der Ukraine gegen diese Macht, das ist unser Kampf. Also es geht um Demokratie, es geht um Menschenrechte und wir müssen uns entscheiden. Entweder offene Gesellschaft, demokratische Gesellschaft oder die Totalität. Entweder Zensur oder Meinungsfreiheit. Entweder wirklich etwas, was wirklich mir, muss ich sagen, sehr, sehr weh tut. Das ist diese Außervorstellung, dass wir wirklich ökonomischen Pragmatismus wirklich als Zentrum von unserem Leben gemacht haben. Aber das genügt mir nicht für dieses Leben. Also ich muss sagen, ich halte die Daumen der Ukraine, weil ich damit auch die Daumen Europa halte, dass wir wirklich, jetzt entscheidet sich, ob Russland diese Vision, dass Russland diese Euroasiatische Union gründet, wo Moskau entscheidet, das ist ähnlich wie China möchte Asiatische Union machen im Zentrum mit Peking. Also das alles hängt in diesem globalen Welt zusammen. Und ich möchte uns allen sagen, wir brauchen jetzt wirklich klaren und so radikalen Verstand. Wir brauchen Solidarität. Wir brauchen ein Wort, das wir absolut vergessen haben, und das ist Humanismus. Und vor allem, wir brauchen wirklich Mut für jeden Tag.
لا يمكن للحرب إلا أن تكون حقيرة، مؤلمة، قاسية، ولا يمكن لنضالات الشعوب من أجل كرامتها واستقلالها إلا أن تكون عظيمة. لقد اختبرنا القصف الروسي وهمجيته في سوريا، لقد دمر منازلنا وقتل أطفالنا ودعم كل الدكتاتوريات التي جثمت على صدورنا لسنوات طويلة. نحن نعرف آلام الشعب الأوكراني، وحين أتلقى سيل الصور التي تأتي من أوكرانيا أشعر بألم شديد. لقد تكررت المأساة التي كان يجب أن لا تتكرر. كان يجب أن يتوقف كل شيء عند سوريا، ويجب أن لا تتكرر هذه المأساة، لكن قد تكررت. لذلك دوما قلبي مع الشعب الأوكراني، مع أطفاله، مع ثقافته، مع مدنه، مع قراه، مع ثقافته العظيمة، وفي نفس الوقت أعرف بأنني ككاتب لا أملك سوى هذا التعاطف الأحمق الذي لا ينفع شيء. أتمنى أن أستطيع ذات يوم أن أكون مفيدا ككاتب للشعب الأوكراني كما لشعب سوريا. لقد عشت الحرب، طوال الحرب بقيت في سوريا وأعرف طعمها ومرارتها. أعرف معنى الجوع ومعنى البرد ومعنى العزلة ومعنى العتمة ومعنى كل شيء تنتجه الحروب. وأعرف أيضا معنى قوة القصف ومعنى الحصار. لقد عشنا في سوريا سنوات 11 سنة ونحن ما زلنا في الحرب. لم تنتهي الحرب في سوريا، لكن كما قلت لكم لقد عاش العالم خذلانه أيضا لسوريا مرة أخرى. أتمنى أن لا يخذل العالم أوكرانيا كما خذل سوريا، وأتمنى للشعب الأوكراني النصر كما أتمنى له استقلاله والحفاظ على كرامته. لا يمكن لنا إلا أن نكون متعاطفين. لا يمكن لأي كائن ينظر إلى الصور القادمة من أوكرانيا إلا أن يكون متعاطفا مع شعب آمن أراد استقلاله وحريته وكرامته، لكن لم تسمح وحوش الأرض له بذلك. لذلك كل يوم أقول يجب أن تنتهي الحرب وينسحب كل المحتلين من أوكرانيا كما من سوريا، وتعود سوريا إلى السوريين وأوكرانيا إلى الأوكرانيين، ليعيشوا بسلام وينتجوا ثقافات عظيمة كما هو تاريخهم الذي لا يمكن إلا أن يشهد لهم بأنهم صناعوا خير وحق وجمال. قلبي معكم في أوكرانيا كما قلبي مع شعبي في سوريا الذي خذله كل العالم، وأتمنى أن لا يخذلكم العالم مرة أخرى كي لا تتكرر المأساة بعجرها. أتمنى أن لا يخذلكم العالم مرة أخرى كما خذلنا في سوريا. قلبي مع الأطفال، قلبي مع النساء الوحيدات، قلبي مع البيوت المدمرة، قلبي مع المدن، مع الشوارع، مع في كل لحظة يخسر العالم معنا للثقافة من جديد.
Hi, my name is Matthew Akins, and I'm an author and a journalist with the New York Times Magazine. And for 13 years now, I've covered the U.S. wars overseas in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've covered conflicts in Syria and Libya, in Yemen, and I've seen firsthand the incredible devastation that wars can do to a country, to its people, to its culture, the lasting scars of violence and corruption that war can leave in its wake, and especially the people whose homes are taken from them and who are forced to flee and become refugees, become displaced. So fortunately, unlike the millions of Afghans and Syrian refugees who are held back by borders and forced to use smugglers, Europe has opened its arms to the Ukrainian people, which is wonderful and very heartening to see. But these situations will last for many years, so we have to keep up, I think, this campaign of solidarity on behalf of Ukrainians and on behalf of all refugees, and help people to build new lives, lives that will, for the foreseeable future, very much be part of a transnational diasporic community.
The war in Ukraine is in full force, but it seems like Europe is getting used to it. In the beginning of the war, there was such an enthusiasm coming from Europeans towards the refugees coming from Ukraine. But now I see that enthusiasm is lessening and the war is normalized. We shouldn't let that happen. And this is not only a European problem, but a global one. So we should normalize the war in Ukraine as we did to all the scattered wars of Third World War in Middle Eastern countries, in Africa and elsewhere. Ukraine has become a venue for European proxy war against Putin. And I think Europeans should not forget that it is too much from Ukrainians to ask for to bring down Putin. We should ask Ukrainians what they want at the end of this war. And we shouldn't put too much expectations on these people. But most importantly, we shouldn't forget the enthusiasm that has been shown by Europeans towards Ukrainians should not lessen. We shouldn't forget that the war is going on and Ukrainians are still suffering. It doesn't mean that they are suffering less when we are interested in less. Those people's predicament, the troubles in Ukraine, should not be more important, less important for Europeans than the rising gas bills. I am in solidarity with Ukrainians, and I am in solidarity with Russians who are deeply ashamed of being represented by Putin.
Ja, dieser Krieg ist ja ein reiner Angriffs- und Eroberungskrieg, für den es überhaupt keine nachvollziehbare Begründung gibt. Alles, was Putin da vorgegeben hat und gefaselt hat von Entnazifizierung, Befreiung der Ukrainer, das lässt sich ja überhaupt nicht halten. Das sind alles Lügengebilde, die erstaunlicherweise in Russland offenbar ihre Wirkung tun. Auch dieses Gerede von einem großen Russland, was meint er damit überhaupt? Ich habe einiges darüber gelesen und es scheint sich einfach auf das Gefühl zu gründen, dass Russen etwas Besseres sind als ein Nachbarvolk wie die Ukrainer. Und das ist dann schwer von Rassismus zu unterscheiden. Mir geht immer wieder dieser Begriff im Kopf herum. Putin sprach von der größten Katastrophe im 20. Jahrhundert und meint damit den Mauerfall und die Folgen. Ja, worin bestand denn eigentlich diese Katastrophe? Die in Putins Augen größte Katastrophe bestand darin, dass knapp 100 Millionen Menschen in Europa die Gelegenheit ergriffen und sich von der Sowjetunion und der Diktatur befreiten. Das ist die Katastrophe, von der Putin spricht. Ich wundere mich, dass so viele Russen an Putins Lügen glauben und dass das im Zeitalter des Internet überhaupt möglich ist. Er hat ihnen doch nichts zu bieten als ein Versprechen nach Größe und Supermacht. Es gibt aber überhaupt keine Garantie. Warum sollten Imperien wie die Sowjetunion, das jetzige Russland, warum sollten diese Imperien ihre Macht nicht verlieren? Sie haben doch ihren Bürgern gar nichts zu bieten, außer Unfreiheit. Ich glaube also, dass gerade Putins Tyrannei kein Recht auf ein ewiges Leben hat. Und es gibt keinen Grund, warum er sich mit der geschrumpften Größe seines Landes nicht abfinden sollte.
I think that everything started with a will of power, which is out of history. I think we were in peace, we were trading, there were exchange of products, there were exchange of money, there were exchange of culture. I don't understand, nobody really understands why you need to invade a country. We know that many of the Russian soldiers, they don't know where they are going, what for. They are not, they don't have really a participation sentiment. They are thrown there like animals. And that's why they just, as soon as possible, they go away or they surround. And I think this is a sign that it is not a war, it is an invasion. It is an invasion. I think that the population of Ukrainian population are behaving very courageously, very courageously. I believe in them. You know, I was small, but I know what has been for the Italy, for example, which was under the fascists, the Nazi fascists, to make the resistance. And that has been, how can I say, the pride of Italy to have made resistance, you know. And then they say, oh, the Americans, they're giving the army. Well, it was the same. When we made the resistance against the fascists, the Allies came and threw the guns and bombs with the plane. So resistance need help from the friends, country which are friends. I think really we can not be with them.
Die Welt weiß es ja. Frau Stalin und Herr Hitler waren ein welthistorisches Ehepaar. Verliebt, verlobt, verheiratet und geschieden. Wladimir Putin ist deren legitimer Sohn. Das Kind wuchs bei der Mutter auf. Im Kreml herrscht nun dieser größenwahnsinnige Giftzwerg. Er hat den kranken Riesen Russland in seine Gewalt gebracht und macht nun einen Eroberungskrieg gegen die Ukraine. Uns Westler kostet dieser Krieg nur Geld und nur Nerven. Aber die Ukrainer zahlen mit ihrem Blut. Ich hoffe, sie gewinnen diesen Krieg gegen den Aggressor. Schon aus Eigeninteresse müssen wir den Ukrainern auch schwere Waffen liefern. Denn sie kämpfen in diesem Freiheitskrieg ja auch für unsere Freiheit. Ein Pazifist konnte einer wie ich nie sein, denn ich habe als deutsches Kommunisten- und Judenkind die Nazi-Diktatur nur überlebt, weil die Alliierten das Heil-Hitler-Volk militärisch besiegt haben. Große Geister wie Albert Einstein oder wie Lord Bertrand Russell waren ja beide Pazifisten aus Prinzip und sie hatten dafür ihre guten Gründe. Als aber eindeutig zu erkennen war, dass die Deutschen einen Zweiten Weltkrieg vorbereiten und einen Völkermord an den Juden. Da korrigierten sich diese beiden Weltgenies, deren lebenskluger Mut passt mir prima. Also singe ich den Refrain meines Liedes, nur wer sich ändert, bleibt sich treu. Nur wer sich ändert, bleibt sich treu. Nur wer sich ändert, bleibt sich treu.
I am from the Middle East, a region where war is an everyday happening in many parts of that. The harsh face of war became tangible for me when in the late 70s, following the invasion of the Soviet army, a wave of Afghan immigrants poured into my country. But the harsher face of the war appeared when in 1982, as a duty officer, I was forced to carry a gun to participate in the war that has started with the neighboring country. Crossing the borders is only possible by killing people and destroying houses, schools, and hospitals. I have lived through war, but still I cannot understand why there are factories in the world making guns and bombs. When does border crossing end? When will the world get rid of crazy people?
I'm Damon Gaugut from South Africa. It's a long way from Europe, and yet the shadow of this war in Ukraine is felt down there, the bottom end of Africa. I know about the Second World War only from a distance through other people's writings, and yet it fills my heart with a kind of a shadow. In a much more immediate sense, we have been through a long war in South Africa, a very different sort of war, but one full of bloodshed, and one that, like all other wars, is suffused with futility. It's a war that makes absolutely no sense and yet fills people's hearts with a kind of horror that goes to the deepest roots of early time in human life. We can only hope it comes to an end as soon as possible.
My name is Aleš Steger from Slovenia, Slovenia that used to be part of Yugoslavia before the wars. When it comes to wars, we are put into the position of speak very clearly, and we have to say, we are obliged to say who is the aggressor and who is the victim. And in the case of the Ukrainian war, it's completely obvious who the aggressor is and who is the victim. At the same time, we have to know that in each war, there is a war before the war and a war that goes on after. The war before the war leads to the actual killing, and war after is the war that goes on in the lives and the souls of those who remain, surrounded by the souls of the dead. We who are not in the midst of the war, usually look at countries, at cultures, at communities only when there is actual fighting going on. And I feel as a personal responsibility to try at least to go beyond that, to talk to as many people as I know, to try to understand how is it possible, and it is possible, but also I deeply hope this war will have an end soon. It will have an end, that my attention to the people suffering won't end with the war ending, that we here in the West will keep our hearts open to all the victims and everyone who will survive this terrible war.
Es gibt ja jetzt immer die Rede von dem Einbruch des Realen durch den Krieg in der Ukraine. Es gibt aber keine Realität des Krieges, es gibt nur seine Irrealität mit extrem realen Auswirkungen. Alles ist falsch. Selbst der Diskurs über einen fossilen Krieg, der darauf aufmerksam machen möchte, dass er eine extreme Breitenwirkung hat. Auch das Erstaunen, dass so etwas in Europa stattfinden kann. Das einzig Reale ist das Elend der betroffenen Menschen. So it goes, würde Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse 5 sagen. Und es ist keine Antwort, die man gerne geben möchte.
I've been for a long time in Ukraine. I visited this country since the late 80s. I have seen many of these places which are shelled and bombed now by Russian rockets and missiles. I've been in Mariupol, in Kharkiv, in Lviv. Especially I have seen the metallurgical plants in Mariupol, which are destroyed now entirely. I've been several times in Kharkiv, which in my view was the most modern place in early 20th century. And I could not believe that it's happening, what is happening now. Kiev, the oldest city, shelled by Russian missiles. And we are sitting here, 1 hour flight from Kiev in Berlin, and we don't know what to do, how to assist against the aggression of Russia, of Putin's Russia. I hope that the German government will support, will give anything which the Ukrainian men and women need for struggling and for recapturing their country. And I hope that the solidarity of the European nations, the populations, will endure. And I am sure that the coming winter will be very hard for the Ukrainians, but also for countries and people who live in Europe. But I'm sure that the brave defenders of the Ukraine independence and sovereignty, they will win. They will win. They must win. Otherwise, it will be a hell for Ukrainians and very dangerous for Europe too. Slava Ukraini.
I'm Sahar Ajdamsani. I'm from Iran. And I'm singer, poet, songwriter, lyricist, writer, and photographer, and activist, world peace, human rights, and women's rights activist. When the war happened, Ukrainian war and Afghanistan war as well, really I feel that I have to do something. Music is so effective. That's why I started producing an album for unity of the world and for world peace and solidarity with Ukrainian war and Afghanistan war as well. what's going on in these two countries really broken my heart. So I started producing an album, and in this album the message is that we all are equal and there is no difference what nationality, what language and what skin color we have. We call for unity of the world and for world peace, and say all nationalities want world peace. And it is very important to teach our kids and children from their childhood peace and all these subjects, good subjects, and teach them from their childhood.
Hello, I am Jānis Juņevs, a writer from Latvia. Well, when the war started, on the 24th of February, I was at my home, safe and sound, but I was really shocked, and I had this feeling that my life is like turned upside down, and that everything I was doing, all my literary projects and cinema projects, that it all has lost sense, that it is absolutely useless, because it helps nothing when there's a war. And I had this feeling that I have no right to feel happy while Ukrainians are dying in this war for us, and I have no right to do some creative projects while there's war, because it's so useless. But then on June, I went with humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and what surprised me is that you keep living, and so people are, they keep smiling and loving and publishing poetry and painting and doing cinema and joking. It was in Kharkiv. There was this pastor, a Protestant priest, who let us in his house to pass a night, and he told that just recently his house was being hit by a Russian rocket, but it didn't explode, but it left like a giant hole in the roof. But he said that he had always wanted some kind of roof window, and now he got it. So, and after that I thought that, well, if Ukrainians are not afraid, then I have no right to be so afraid as I was before. So thanks Ukraine for learning all us some courage. And the second thing is that if Ukraine keeps making art, then maybe it's not so useless, and I can keep going. Thank you, Ukraine, and keep fighting. You have to win this war for the sake of the world, and Latvia stands with you.
Mein Name ist Gerhard Steidl. Ich bin nach dem Krieg geboren, und als ich mich als junger Mann mit den Folgen des Zweiten Weltkriegs auseinandergesetzt habe, war für mich wirklich sehr schnell klar, dass ich zeitlebens ein Pazifist sein wollte. Das habe ich durchgehalten bis zu dem Tag, an dem Russland die Ukraine überfallen hat. Ich habe nachgedacht, ob eine militärische Unterstützung notwendig ist, und bin zu dem Ergebnis gekommen, dass dies wohl sein muss. Ich unterstütze das zwar nicht, weil ich Pazifist bin, aber wenn dadurch die Freiheit des Landes und das Überleben der Menschen garantiert ist, wird man es wohl tolerieren müssen. Vielmehr bin ich aber dafür, finanzielle, humanitäre und kulturelle Hilfestellung zu leisten, damit vor allen Dingen die Wunden nach dem Krieg, der hoffentlich bald zu Ende ist, heilen können.
When this war began, my father was dying. When my father was still a child, the other war began, Second World War, and he had to flee to England all alone without his parents. To be with my father in his last days, I took the trains between Berlin and Vienna many times. Suddenly, these trains were full of refugees, mothers and children fleeing Ukraine to the West. For me, this felt like a time loop, and I was glad that my father didn't really notice the new war anymore. But this time loop means to me there's not much to learn from history. As long as there are dictators who think they can gain something by waging wars, you have to stay defensible. It's nice to proclaim peace and freedom, but you have to be able to enforce it. Until then, the Ukrainians will also pay for the laziness and naivety of the West. This is also a mental disaster, especially for my generation. Right when we were coming to age, the Iron Curtain fell, the Berlin Wall came down, and the world became wide and open again. Since then, my generation seemed to be a quite optimistic one. We were used to believe in reason and human progress. This belief, too, is now in ruins.
I'm Akbar, and since I know about politics, and then I learned in this context the Vietnam War, the Cambodia War, and then the occupation of Afghanistan through the Soviet Union, and then the religion fights against Soviet Union, and later the fight between Iran and Iraq, and then the decolonial activities and wars against the colonialists, and then the very sad story of Sarajevo, because Sarajevo was somehow occupied, and from the top of the mountains they killed people, women, children. And then it continued with Chechnya, with Syria, and now we are in Ukraine. And what in Ukraine happens is, I think all of us we know, they tortured people, they tortured women, they raped women, and they killed kids. And at the same time they destroyed hospitals, cultural institutions, and so forth. And I think the most important thing is, from my point of view, that the human being has both the destructive part and the very positive part. And I believe in a civil society and in democracy. And I think that's only our chance. We have to fight for it, for the democracy.
Ich glaube, zu dem Krieg ist bereits alles gesagt worden, obwohl ich ehrlicherweise zugeben muss, dass ich, was die Details betrifft, dann eher auf Militärhistoriker höre, als auf die Auslassungen von Schauspielern oder Yogalehrern, die offene Briefe unterzeichnen für angebliche Verhandlungslösungen etc. Ich habe es dann schon lieber handfest, und ich würde auch gerne sprechen von der deutschen Verantwortung. Die deutsche Verantwortung liegt darin, dass man Putin ermutigt hat, diesen Krieg zu führen, durch eine wirtschaftliche Kollaboration mit seinem Regime, das eben nicht erst seit dem 24. Februar 2022 massenmörderisch ist, sondern bereits seit Jahren in Aleppo, in Grosny. Dinge sind vorher passiert, die man hätte wissen können und wissen müssen. Und wenn der deutsche Bundespräsident sagt, mit dem Kenntnisstand von heute sehe etwas anders aus, dann ist das eine ungeheure Geschichtslüge, die man zurückweisen muss. Und ich würde mir dann auch wünschen, von all den Schriftstellern, die so gern eingeladen sind, in Schloss Bellevue mal ehrliche Worte zu finden zu diesem Politiker, der zusammen mit Gerhard Schröder und mit anderen wie kein anderer für diese Verflechtung wirtschaftlicherweise mit dem Putin-Regime steht und für ein jahrelanges Herunterreden von dessen mörderischen Praktiken. Am 24. Februar ist nichts Neues passiert, sondern eine neue Phase ist eingetreten. Und ich glaube, das muss man sich klar machen, damit man nicht jedes Mal wie die Kuh vor dem offenen Tor steht und fragt, warum und why. Damit hätte niemand rechnen können. Es war damit zu rechnen. Und in Deutschland gibt es maßgebliche Kreise, die dieses Wissen hatten und eine Debatte darüber verhindert hatten, wobei nicht eine einzige Partei da zu kritisieren ist, sondern die gesamte Gesellschaft. Ich würde sagen, vielleicht mit Ausnahme der Grünen und mit Ausnahme von Schriftstellern wie Hertha Müller oder Peter Schneider, die ganz klar schon sehr zeitig auf den Charakter des Putin-Regimes hingewiesen haben. Und aus diesem Grund, wir deutschsprachige Schriftsteller sind ganz sehr angewiesen auf die Expertise unserer osteuropäischen Kollegen und Kolleginnen. Bitte helfen Sie uns auch in dieser Hinsicht Licht in diesen Nebel zu bringen, der von den hiesigen Verantwortlichen weiter gestreut wird.
If suffering and war come to your home, then you may need turn the whole world into your home. If there is not a chance to go to Odessa for a literature festival, then it's a good idea to turn every city into Odessa to celebrate literature. Celebrating literature in the time of war is celebrating life. No warplane, no murderous bullets can stop the wish for uniting around books and literature and sharing culture. Against war in Ukraine, we support freedom of people and freedom of literature. Thank you.
What is war? This is a question I can't answer. Neither I nor my children have ever lived in a war zone. This is certainly one of the biggest privileges of my Western European life. So I think this is a question best left to those who are actually experiencing war or have experienced it. But I do know what the opposite of war is, and it's not peace. The opposite of war is justice. To simply call out for peace in the face of a violent injustice is shallow. It doesn't solve the situation. If there is a powerful entity like a country or an individual or a social group which is waging a violent aggression against a less powerful, a more powerless group, to simply call out for peace basically means siding with the bully. So what one should call out for is justice to end wars. And this might mean taking up arms and helping the bullied to defend itself. Only then does peace really have a meaning, when justice is attained. War is the most cruel and terrible injustice in the world, and only justice can bring it to a durable end.
Right now, there's a pretty widely shared horror about what is being done to Ukraine, or the people that countries are trying to do to Ukraine. But I think it's really important to think to ourselves that Ukraine is not a natural victim or an inevitable victim. There's no question that geography can be very tough, and it's tough to be a country. No matter how great the culture, no matter how great the history, it's tough to be a culture in a country which is stuck between two, if you like, imperial powers, rival imperial powers, which over the centuries, in a sense, one after the other, have created drama and tragedy for the people of Ukraine. But what's astonishing is that this is a civilization, a culture, a language, a people, which through history has always had a pretty strong and clear idea of who they are and what their place is and what their territory is. And I don't think of this in terms of 19th century nationalism or in terms of, you know, a sort of sense of almost impossible defensiveness. I think of it as a really interesting and creative culture and civilization which flowers and flowers and flowers again and meets the challenges and meets the dramas. So here we are. It's yet another drama, and Russia is 100% wrong. There is absolutely no justification for what's taking place. But what we know from history is that Ukraine and the people of Ukraine understand the situation and will deal with it, no matter how tough it will be. And what we have to do, those of us who live far away, like Canada, North America, or South America, and elsewhere in Europe, is that we have to be friends and be loyal and be supportive in whatever way is necessary to help Ukrainians and Ukraine come out of this in the best possible way.
It has been 7 months since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. In his lust for power, he is responsible for the deaths of thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and children, the creation of 10 million refugees, and the internal displacement of 1/3 of Ukraine's population. An untold number of Russian soldiers have been sacrificed to his megalomania. Investigators are documenting violations of international law, war crimes by Russian forces against civilians in occupied territories, incidents of rape, torture, executions, and looting have been verified. Cluster bombs are dropped on residential neighborhoods, schools, maternity wards, and hospitals. Genocide is ongoing as Putin pushes again ahead with his plan to engulf all of Ukraine in his nostalgia for the Soviet Union and the Tsarist Russian Empire. Putin is accelerating the climate crisis by limiting access to natural gas, less polluting than other fossil fuels. He is forcing new investments in oil, coal, liquefied natural gas, and fossil fuel infrastructure. His war is setting back the decarbonization of the global economy. By obstructing vital grain exports from Ukraine, Putin will starve the developing world. In Russia, free speech has been trampled into the ground. The so-called spreading of deliberately false information can lead to 10 years in prison. One of the most prominent of thousands of Russians in prison for speaking the truth is opposition leader Vladimir Karamurza, jailed last April after calling Putin's government corrupt, kleptocratic, and a regime of murderers. Putin threatens to play the nuclear card if the West intervenes on the ground or in the air, and who can know whether he would unleash an apocalyptic World War III in a demented moment of après-moi le déluge. But perhaps his delusions of grandeur and boundless greed will keep him from liberating his own country along with the rest of the world. I envy Dante, who could send people to a hell he believed to exist. Putin would go to the seventh circle to boil in blood forever.